of got into a really, I thought, interesting discussion of what does it mean to be outside the human family. And I had mentioned the example of Coco the gorilla, who like knows sign language and can communicate and has all this really empathetic ability to talk to humans, but is outside the human family, right? And so, what does it mean to be outside the human family, and who gets to determine who's outside the human family? And then I think another theme that we've been discussing in my class, which has been really exciting, is um, from a historical perspective, how is this a romantic novel? And what are its critiques of the Enlightenment? And what does it mean to recognize that absolute reason and absolute knowledge and experimentation have limits? And how does this relate to sort of our own time, where we have all this technology and all this power? We walk around and we can pretty much listen to any song ever recorded. We can watch any movie like ever produced ever. We can pretty much read any book ever written wherever we go, anytime. I can call someone living in South Africa like instantly. But how do maybe our ethics hasn't caught up to our technology? Maybe we have more technology tends to develop faster than ethics, and I think that's a theme in the novel that is very resonant for our own time.
Yeah, certainly Mary Shelley was specifically concerned about that. Is ethics keeping up with the rising industrial revolution and all the interesting scientific experiments that were happening at her time? Galvani's work, and Volta, I believe, was doing this kind of, frightening but exciting work in, electricity, biological kind of mechanisms, right? So at her level, for us in 2021, it's like, oh, this was simple science. This was like pre-modern techniques that don't have resonance for our time, where we can, like you were saying, connect from the palm of our hand. But think about what I'm thinking about too is these other technologies that are rapidly advancing, like the CRISPR genetic technology, right? The genetic engineering broadly, and the decisions that parents are able to make these days about, certain preferences they may have with, children in utero, and beyond that, just the notion that we've come so far, we can control, and probably throughout the century we'll even gain greater control over fundamental questions of life itself. And what troubles me is, once you can make those, once you can begin answering some of those questions, the answer you choose to give can be incredibly dangerous for those who lack that control or lack that power, right? And that's where I think Victor is this symbol for us of how not to be, right? And it doesn't mean that we don't aim for scientific, ambitious heights, right? That is still valid. But I don't know, Mr. Golko, have you guys talked a lot about, like, where does Victor really go wrong? It's not just that he makes the creature, right? It's that he does what? What does he do afterwards?
Well, that's what we were talking about right before he came in. He abandons his creation.
Exactly. So I wonder, just to maybe transition here to this notion of feeling abandoned. And obviously we have the monster's kind of perspective in the text, but I wanted to bring up this artistic work. And as we kind of continue our conversation, let this kind of fill the space. So this, again, is that Haitian artist Hertz Nazir's painting, kind of representing his experiences with and struggles with sickle cell disease. And I've been really struck by this work in the last few weeks. Forgive my imperfect video here. But I wonder if you and all of people present here can articulate or just kind of contemplate what an image like this expresses. And can we also move into a deeper discussion of the monster's expressiveness in Frankenstein, kind of seeing him as this victim, this solo victim, who obviously is not suffering from a particular disease necessarily, but has been abandoned, is so lonely, and for those reasons, more than any physical pain, right, is truly in a state of, um, inhuman, unconscionable suffering, which is turning towards violence, obviously, right? I don't know. So, any thoughts about how we view such experiences and how we maybe need to um, contemplate, especially from the patient's side of some of these bigger questions that our students are considering in regards to these genetic diseases, right? So, so here's an example of an artist who has sickle cell who is reflecting on the pain of that disease, but it's not just, from my understanding, it's not just the physical pain, like I'm saying, it's the pain of feeling like others cannot and don't want to understand. Um, can you guys can you make a connection to the monsters experience, Mr. Guckel? Do you see
Well,
resonance there?
I thought Janaya's comment earlier today was really good, where she talks about being like outside of the family. You and how I think the monster has a very visible physical difference, which pushes him outside the human family, despite his inner empathy and feeling. But I also think that you know uh, our society, American society in 2021, we're not we're not very good at talking about loneliness. We're not very good at talking about difference. And I think interestingly, one of the things that has made us more lonely is our technology. We now even school, right, is so infused with technology. And I think that I guess the real point I'm trying to make is that um, there's a lot of shame that comes with loneliness. It to say you're lonely is a very shameful thing, because it implies some kind of personal failing, that you haven't done the work to make friends, or there's something wrong with you that makes people not want to be with you. But people are lonely for a variety of reasons, right? And often, most of the time, people's loneliness isn't their own fault. I remember there's a memory that really stays with me of visiting my great grandmother. Lived in a state-run nursing home in the coal region in Pennsylvania.
Mm.
And I remember my grandmother, her daughter, would take me to visit my great grandmother. And my great grandmother was in her late 90s, and she really wasn't very communicative. But I remember going to this nursing home. It was this very sad experience. Even as a kid, it kind of felt sad. And I remember there was this old man sitting in the community room of this nursing home. I must have been 6 or 7 years old, but this memory's really stayed with me. And this old man said, "Oh, I want a hug." This old man, all he wanted was a hug, was a human connection. And I think the monster's not so different, right? The monster just wants human connection and human acceptance. And we're really, I think, both in our own specific culture now, but also in the pretty different culture of 19th century, early 19th century Europe, loneliness is something that we're not very good at dealing with. And I think that the novel really speaks to that universal theme of the difficulty and the shame that comes with loneliness.
Yeah, and just loss. Imagine, I was reading last night that the life expectation back in Mary Shelley's time in the early 19th century was late 30s. Many people would live beyond that, but so many people died young of various diseases and just violent, aspects of life in that time. The romantics that Shelley was a part of really had this deeper understanding, I think, of the preciousness of life, but also, the precariousness of it, right? And how we I think get used to take things for granted. But I do think we're living through an era, like you seem to be saying, Mr. Gokul, of loneliness, right? We're separated. COVID has exacerbated a lot of our separation. We can connect, we can be on Zoom together and have great conversations, but I do think that we have to work harder to remember the other human beings in the room. And I'm reminded of, the great John Rawls's, theoretical work and his concepts of justice. I know that you and your history classes will be getting deeper into human rights as we kind of keep working on the Fire Project and move past spring break. I wonder your thoughts, we're coming up on our end of we're 20 minutes now, but as we kind of put a cap on this Frankenstein 15, do you yourself endorse any particular ethical perspectives when it comes to these larger medical technological questions that Frankenstein invites us to consider? Or is there a particular theory that you're interested in sharing with your students that you think they need to contemplate? I've left my notes here, as you can see on the screen. I'm fascinated by the notion of this fairness principle, that when we contemplate ourselves as moral beings, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of another, right? We have to think. So if it's a doctor treating a patient, he or she has to understand, not just the pain that's being treated, the condition that needs to be addressed, but the person who is experiencing that condition must be given, that greater consideration. And that person, if it's true what we're saying, that person may be suffering as deeply from loneliness and separation from his or her fellow human beings than he or she is from some sort of genetic condition or disease as we understand it, right? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think those of you in Mrs. Bird's class have already talked a little bit about Rawls. And you'll be introduced to Rawls in my class tomorrow. Rawls's theory is this idea that in order to figure out the right way to treat other people, you have to imagine that you're taken out of the world, and there's going to be, you get to decide as sort of like God, how much inequality exists in the world and how people are treated. But the catch is, when you're put back into the world, you don't know whether you're going to come back as a low status person or a high status person. So the amount of inequality you create you should be comfortable with coming back as a poor person, because you don't know how you're going to come back. And I think that this idea of this veil of ignorance, that you don't know where you're going to come back, is a very useful perspective. I'm not sure if Rawls' theory is the best, but I definitely think that of the four theories that we learn about in ninth grade, I think utilitarianism is probably the most problematic. We live in a world where we're constantly trying to make the most absolute happiness, and the problem with that is that certain people can end up very deprived in a theory where you're just trying to make the most happiness in abstract terms. So I think that whatever ethical theory or position you endorse, it really needs to focus on the individual and individual happiness and individual experience. And I think, as my class will learn, and maybe you've talked about already a little bit with Mrs. Bird, utilitarianism really does not do that very well, in my opinion.
Agreed. Yeah, that came up in a nice discussion I had with some of Ms. Randall's students yesterday, specifically Ginny Toso and Joseph Phillips. We were getting into an interesting discussion about their work on, I think it was Down syndrome and then ALS, and they were kind of considering those two diseases in common. But we got deep into the discussion of how, especially parents who are maybe working with a doctor who has conducted a test where they're told that a baby is likely to develop Downs. In many, many cases these days, the doctor will just assume that they don't want that baby to be born, right? And I know, Ava, you've been working on Downs, and I can't wait to see what you guys do in your podcast discussion. But the reason I mention that is to make sure that we're all aware of the ethical considerations that other scholars have put before us, that have asked us to contemplate. And like Mr. Guckold's saying, I think if we approach everything from a strictly utilitarian argument, we're at risk of neglecting those people in the world who can really teach us something about the wealth and breadth of human experience, including those with, terrible genetic conditions that do limit their life experiences, but also need to be valued, also need to be seen as precious, moments of humanity that we can never undersell or undervalue. So with that, I think